Hello, and welcome to Teen Talk Politics Made Simple. I'm Mallory Hinck, and today we're diving into one of the most talked about yet misunderstood aspects of American democracy, the Electoral College. If you've ever wondered about how the U.S. elects its president, or why it's even necessary, you're not alone. Whether it's the election night drama, the question of why a candidate can win the popular vote yet still lose the presidency, or debates about reforming the system, the Electoral College is central to understanding the election process. So let's break it all down. What the Electoral College is, how it works, and why America uses it. To put it simply, the Electoral College is the system used to elect the President and Vice President of the United States. It's a process, not a physical place. The Electoral College was created by the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 as a part of the original design for the American political system. They were designing a system to balance power between smaller states and larger states, and then between the people and the elites. The framers of the Constitution didn't trust direct democracy, fearing that the public might be swayed by mob mentality or the lack of knowledge needed to make the informed choice. Compulsory education did not begin until 1852, with the first state requiring education being Massachusetts. They also wanted to make sure that smaller states weren't ignored in the process of choosing a president. So they created a system where electors, individuals chosen by each state, would cast votes for the president, instead of the public voting directly for a candidate. Alright, now let's talk about how the system actually works. Here's the structure. There are 538 electors in total, and it takes a majority, at least 270 votes, to win the presidency. Each state gets a number of electors equal to the number of its congressional representatives, so the more people a state has, the more electors it gets. Every state has 2 senators to represent them in the United States Senate, so 2, plus the number of congressional districts the state has based on their population, is the number of electoral votes the state has. Congressional districts are a way to divide citizens into electoral groups so that everyone can be represented equally. So take California, for example, the most populous state. It has 52 congressional districts plus 2 senators, which grants them 54 electoral votes in total, while a smaller state like Wyoming has just 3. New Hampshire has 2 congressional districts and 2 senators in the U.S. Senate, so in total, we have 4 electoral votes. D.C. also gets 3 electors, even though it's not a state, thanks to the 23rd Amendment passed in 1961. Now, in almost every state, the winner of the popular vote gets all the state's electoral votes. This is called the winner-takes-all system. The only exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, where they allocate their electors proportionally. Once the votes are counted on Election Day, electors meet in their state capitals to cast their votes for president and vice president. If a candidate gets at least 270 out of the 538 votes, they win the presidency. If no one gets 270, the election goes to the House of Representatives to decide the winner, with each state delegation casting 1 vote for the president. Now that we've covered the nuts and bolts of how the Electoral College works, let's take a step back and ask, why does America even have this system? Why do we not just have direct vote, where the candidate with the most votes nationwide wins? The answer lies in the history of the United States and the balance of power the Founding Fathers were trying to strike between states and between the people and the government. At the time, the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the Founding Fathers were looking for a middle ground between 2 conflicting ideas: direct democracy, which they feared could lead to chaos or tyranny, and the ideal of a more elitist parliamentary-style system, where only a select few would decide who leads the country. The Electoral College was born out of compromise. It allowed for a buffer between the public and the presidency, while still giving people voice in the election through the electors chosen by the popular vote. There was also concern about the fairness between large and small states. If the president were elected purely by popular vote, candidates would focus their efforts on the more populous states, leaving rural or less populated states without a voice. By giving states electoral votes based on their population, the system is designed to ensure that both large and small states have a role in choosing the president. Of course, no system is without its flaws or criticism. One of the biggest criticisms of the Electoral College is that it can lead to situations where the winner of the popular vote doesn't win the presidency. This has happened 5 times in American history, including in 2000, when Al Gore won the popular vote but George W. Bush won the Electoral College. But this is a special case we'll be coming back to later. It also happened again in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump secured the presidency. This happens because the winner-takes-all system can result in a candidate winning a state by a small margin, but still receiving all of its electoral votes. In contrast, losing by a small margin means getting 0 electoral votes. This means that a candidate can win a few large states by narrow margins and still win the presidency, while a candidate who wins many smaller states by large margins could lose the election. Another criticism is the overrepresentation of smaller states. For example, Wyoming has just over 500,000 people, but it has 3 electoral votes, which is equal to 1 electoral vote for every 170,000 people. On the other hand, California has nearly 40 million people, but only one electoral vote for every 700,000 people. So the vote of someone in Wyoming has more weight than the vote of someone in California, leading to claims of unfairness in how votes are distributed. As you can imagine, these issues have led to calls for the reforming or even abolishing the Electoral College. Some propose a national popular vote, where the winner of the overall popular vote would automatically win the presidency, no matter what happens in the states. Others suggest proportional allocation of electoral votes, so that even in the states that lean heavily towards one party, minority voices would be heard. In the recent years, a movement known as the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has gained traction. It's an agreement between a group of states to award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, but only once enough states join in to guarantee that outcome. So far, 16 states and DC have signed on representing 195 electoral votes, but it would need 270 electoral votes to take effect. All of New England, excluding New Hampshire, has signed on this. So why hasn't the Electoral College been abolished yet? Part of it is the challenge of amending the U.S. Constitution. It's not an easy process. Changing the Electoral College would require a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate, plus ratification by 3/4 of the states. This is a very, very high bar, especially given that states still benefit from the current system. Additionally, there are those who argue that the Electoral College still serves important functions. It reinforces the federal nature of the United States by ensuring that states have a voice in the election. It also helps prevent candidates from focusing only on the heavy populated urban areas, making candidates having to campaign across the country, including smaller or rural states. Alright, let's wrap this section up. The Electoral College is a unique and sometimes controversial feature of American democracy. It has its origins in the compromise made by the Founding Fathers, and while it's faced criticism, it remains a central part of how we elect our president. Whether you love it, hate it, or fall somewhere in between, understanding how the Electoral College works is key to understanding how American elections function. Okay, remember how I said we would be coming back to the 2000 election? Now it's time to dive into one of the most intense, confusing, and unforgettable elections in the U.S. history. The 2000 presidential race between George W. Bush and Al Gore. If you're a teenager like me, you probably weren't around for this election, but don't worry, I've got you covered on the full story. It was a battle that went all the way to U.S. Supreme Court, and trust me, it was a mess. So let's break it down. Okay, first, let's set the stage. In the year 2000, the United States was gearing up for a big election. The two main candidates were Al Gore, who was the current vice president under Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, the governor of Texas and son of former President George H.W. Bush. The country was coming out of the 90s, a time of prosperity, economic growth, and peace. And the big question was, who would be the one to take the country into a new millennium? So Al Gore, he was all about the environmental issues, global warming, and pushing the country into a future with technology and innovation. On the other hand, George W. Bush was like the everyman candidate. He was the guy who seemed more down to earth, and he talked a lot about values, family, and a more compassionate kind of conservatism. Okay, now here's where things get really wild. Election night, November 7th, 2000, comes around. The polls are closing, and the race is tight. At first, it looks like Gore has the edge because he had 255 electoral votes, compared to Bush, who had 246. Then, in the early hours of the night, we get the projections from TV networks. Some say that Gore has won Florida. Others say that Bush has won Florida. And it keeps flipping back and forth like no one can make up their minds. What's going on here? Well, turns out Florida was the key battleground state, and the vote was incredibly close. We're talking less than 1,000 votes separating Bush and Gore out of the nearly 6 million votes cast. And I know what you're thinking. How could that happen? Well, the answer lies in the crazy system that we call the Electoral College. Florida's 25 electoral votes were up for grabs, and whoever got them would likely win the presidency. So here's where things get even crazier. Florida is so close. They started a recount on the demand from Gore. The state began to recount votes in 4 crucial counties. But it's not a simple recount. Some ballots were really hard to read. Ever heard of the term hanging chad? Yeah, that's a thing. In some places, the little hole punches on the ballots weren't fully punched through, so that the paper that was supposed to be punched through hung onto the ballot. Some votes were ambiguous. Can you imagine? People argued whether those votes should be counted or not. Lawyers were showing up everywhere, filing lawsuits over how the votes should be counted. And the drama didn't stop there. Now, this is where the Supreme Court comes in. After weeks of back and forth recounting, a bunch of legal battles and confusion, the case ends up at the United States Supreme Court. On December 12, 2000, the court rules in a 5-4 decision that the recount should stop. The reasoning? The different ways the ballots were counted in Florida violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. In other words, they decided that the recount process was too inconsistent to continue. So George W. Bush was declared the winner of the 2000 election by the Supreme Court, and he ended up winning the presidency. But here's the kicker. Al Gore actually won the popular vote. Yep, you heard that right. Gore got more total votes across the country than Bush did, around 500,000 more votes. But remember, it's the Electoral College that counts, and Bush won enough states, thanks to Florida, to secure the 270 votes he needed to win. Talk about a crazy twist, right? Even though the decision was made, a lot of people still felt like something was wrong. It was one of those situations where people weren't sure if the right guy had won, and it was all so messy. To this day, the 2000 election is remembered as one of the most controversial in the U.S. history. So looking back at all this chaos, what can we take away from the 2000 election? First off, it showed just how important every single vote is. In Florida, a handful of votes decided the entire election. Second, it raised questions about the Electoral College. Should a candidate who loses the popular vote still win the presidency? That's something a lot of people still debate today. And lastly, it highlighted how close and competitive U.S. elections can be. One state, one country, one vote. They can all make a huge difference. All right, so how did this election impact the future? Well, George W. Bush went on to serve 2 terms as president, and during his time in office, the country faced a ton of big challenges, including 9/11 and the Iraq War. As for Al Gore, he didn't give up on his mission. He became an environmental activist and even won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work in climate change. So while the 2000 election didn't go his way, he definitely made a lasting impact. But that's the crazy story of the 2000 election. A whole lot of drama, confusion, and history being made. It's one of those moments in U.S. politics that makes you really appreciate just how unpredictable and sometimes even chaotic elections can be. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Electoral College and the 2000 election. I hope this episode has helped clear up some of the confusion around how the system works, why it exists, and the debates surrounding it. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.